Finally they all came to their grandmother's house. She had a small house near a field. It was just the day after the Kraken attack. Grandma met the guests at the gate, which made her daughter and son-in-law nervous. They were worried why she didn't stay in the house. After all, she was sick. But the sweet old lady calmly replied that she decided to meet them because she missed them very much. And of course, she wanted to see her grandchildren as soon as possible. She looked into the car and sighed heavily when she saw the tired faces of the children. They were already sleeping peacefully in the back seats, so Grandma decided not to disturb them and let them rest. No Yunha woke up already on the bed in the house. Right on his chest, throwing a leg over him as well, was his sister sleeping. He stared at the ceiling doomedly, and not understanding how she could sleep like that, he carefully got up so as not to wake No Yunha. Nearby, he noticed his parents sleeping in a similar position. Apparently, the habit of sleeping like this was passed down from his mother. Gently covering her sweetly sleeping with a blanket, No Yunha quietly left the room. He sat down on a table in the courtyard and fell into thought, while it was just starting to get dark around him. He had more mana now. But why that was so he didn't know, and he suspected it might be because of his gift. Before the boy returned to his childhood, his gift was Berserk. The essence of it was that the more mana a player lost, the stronger he became. Although based on the name, the more mana he loses, the crazier he becomes. But, as he still picked up on it, back then, at the fight with the Kraken, his sanity was fine. And if this so-called fine is missing, then it's a better world then. And perhaps there was still something No Yunha didn't know about berserkers. His thoughts were interrupted by his grandmother, with a question as to why he was still awake. He was a little surprised to see her, as he didn't feel her presence at all when she approached. But he answered that he had already slept in the car. Grandma asked him if he was sure and covered him with her sweater, adding just in time that if her little one wanted to become an adult, he would have to sleep a lot. But Yunha laughed sweetly in response, recognizing that very characteristic of his grandmother. She's always there for him when he's deep in thought. And she waits for the guy to start talking. It doesn't even matter what, problems, feelings, just about anything. Interrupting the wait, the guy asked her why Grandma wasn't sleeping. And she replied that it was because her grandson was awake. He got a little embarrassed, and just realized. All the time No Yunha wanted to be near his grandmother no longer as a child. She playfully asked him at that moment if he wanted some warm milk, to which he politely declined. Mom, behind his back, suddenly asked if he was sure he didn't want some. And her sudden appearance scared the boy a little. He didn't even notice when she came. In her hands was already a tray with warm milk ready, and she interrogated who would drink it then. But Yunha gave in, and was already enjoying the warm drink a moment later. And his mom, after sitting down on the platform with them, started a conversation with his grandmother, asking her if she realized how shocked everyone was by her call. The grandmother, however, reiterated that she was perfectly fine, and that her neighbor just exaggerates sometimes. But nevertheless, her daughter got very excited when she was told that she had fainted. As the kid pointed out, the grandmother had just stumbled and got off very lightly, thankfully. She claimed she was just distracted, which the daughter was a little confused about. The grandmother began to say that maybe she had imagined it, but as she was walking up the stairs she saw him. Her daughter wanted to interrupt her, but she laughed that she was now a marasmus and asked her to listen to the end. The man stood at the top of the stairs, waving his arms and telling her not to go up. But thinking about it now, Granny thought that he was not saying that for her, but for his daughter. But Yunha, just like her mother, thought about it. Calling her vision just a fantasy would be strange. If something went wrong, the whole family would die just like Grandpa. And if it was him, she should have been told about it sooner. In the meantime, Grandma began to remember another very recent dream. Grandpa told her that there was a fawn outside, so she went out to see, and it was Yunha. Grandma patted her little fawn on the head, and his mom suddenly asked about the animal. The old lady was also interested. According to No Yunha's mom, she also had a similar dream where her father left her a baby deer. The grandmother's eyes lit up, She was very impressed by her daughter's words and wanted to add something more, but she started to talk back. Then she changed the subject and asked her son what he wanted to be when he grew up. He started to answer, but suddenly froze in thought. Remembering the horrifying images and the heartbreaking cries for help, he was petrified. All of this frightened him, and his mother, noticing his strange reaction, thoughtfully decided to ask what was wrong. But Yunha, still tense, turned to her, and after a few seconds of silence, replied that everything was fine, and he just didn't know what he wanted. His grandmother reassured him that it was perfectly fine if he didn't know it. The guy was really interested in Grandma's words, and she in turn kept talking. But Yunha, she said, was still young, so there was no hurry for him yet. She advised him to just live all the happy and hard moments, to make friends and quarrel with them, to study and play diligently. And so one day, he would finally find his calling. His grandmother urged him to just live until he realizes what he likes best. But Yunha was a bit tense about it, because she was just telling him to live a happy life. And her words were supported by Mrs. No. She assured that everything Granny said was true, that time was indeed on Yunha's side. They both hugged the baby tightly, telling him that he would definitely be able to do anything, which made him shocked. The mom, still not letting him go, started talking about the meaning of her son's name. Yunha means the universe with infinite power. And to this the boy was surprised, as he didn't know what his name meant before. Listening to his mom's promise to always be proud of her son no matter what he did, he wanted to answer her something. But he was interrupted by his grandmother, adding that she too would always support him. He was embarrassed and wanted to say something to her, but this time he was interrupted by his sister. Suddenly, a girl came outside, alerting everyone that she too wanted milk. Ms. No asked when she had already woken up, and her grandmother invited her to join them. The girl climbed onto their platform right along with her blanket. When asked by her grandmother if she wanted to take her glass, she very immediately quite agreed. Her brother thought it was cute too, he even blushed a little. And then he suddenly remembered something, and turning to her grandmother, he handed her some red flowers. She was really touched by it, and she happily promised her grandson to put them on the nightstand in the hallway for everyone to see. As No Yunha had noticed before he was reborn, if a grandmother puts something close to the entrance, it means she wants to show it off. But she probably doesn't know it herself. Since Granny was very happy to receive such a small gift, it didn't really matter. The main thing, the guy thought, was to give her more such good memories in this life. He continued to just look at her with the warmest and most loving gaze. And it was to her that he was eternally grateful for raising him. Already a while later, after the No family returned to their home apartment, their parents very suddenly decided to tell Yuna and Yunha something. Although Mom was a bit embarrassed, Dad rather, and animatedly told the children that they were expecting a new addition soon. But Yunha didn't quite have time to digest the information, and Yuna, overjoyed that she was going to have another baby brother, rushed into her parents' arms. But then her mother turned her attention to the now trembling Yunha. She didn't quite understand his reaction, and gently approached her son to check if everything was all right. The boy, covered in tears, raised his head to her and began to thank his mom profusely. They were tears of happiness, and he was very happy about the new family member. He choked back the same tears, but didn't stop saying that this was the best thing that had ever happened to him since he was born. He was very touched, which humbled his mom a lot. His father, on the other hand, was a little surprised by this reaction. One would think that the father of this baby was not him, but Yunha, as he was so happy. This made everyone cheer, but the kid continued to wipe away his tears. He continued to go to Duan's kindergarten as promised to his parents. And already there, 3 girls, obviously playing mother-daughter, came running to him, calling him nicely, and asking if he missed his mom. Yunha was playing the dog, and only barked in response. At that moment, the boy was already 7 years old. When the girls noticed that he was crying, they started stroking his head and questioning him, trying to calm him down. They all continued to play, and Yunha could hardly contain himself, assuring everyone that he wasn't crying. His emotions were replaced by anger when a girl sitting nearby with a mug said that Pochi, that is No Yunha, was not cute at all. It was that arrogant Min Ji, and she advised the girls to just throw this mongrel Yunha out. The guy was annoyed to the point of annoyance as she purposely provoked him at every opportunity. He started to just growl in her direction without getting out of character. But since Min Ji didn't like it, she threatened that she would tell everything to the teacher, and he would punish him. Yunha got over himself and somehow managed to bark sweetly back at her. It was the teacher who, while the boy was sleeping peacefully, came up with this sinister plan and put it in the hands of the girls. You might say, just threw him in the animal cage. Another boy had just joined the company, taking the attention away from him. And while the children continued to pretend to be a family, No Yunha carefully and quietly escaped from them. While the girls were greeting the newly returned father, he, having waited for the right moment, slipped into the next room. Already there he could exhale quietly and take off the hoop with dog ears. On the way, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed his girlfriend sitting at a table with a book. He approached her with interest and asked her what she was reading. She answered that it was a novel about Sherlock Holmes, and lately she had become obsessed with him. Yunha tried to remember what he knew about the book and told her the ending, where Sherlock and Professor Moriarty fell down a waterfall and died. The girl froze looking at him, and he suddenly realized that he had accidentally spoiled the plot for her. But that was enough for the little girl with the cute bow, because she hadn't read the book yet, so she thought Yunha was evil. He immediately apologized and kind of reassured her that the hero would come back alive in Sherlock Holmes Returns. But that was also a spoiler, and the girl got even more upset. She even started crying, thinking Yunha was very evil. And the guy, realizing what he had done, started apologizing again, assuring her that he was really sorry, and decided to leave as soon as possible, so as not to embarrass her or himself anymore. The boy, exhaling again, strolled further into the rooms, his attention caught by the words about wasted blood. He joined the crowd of boys, where in the very center, after the fight, one of the boys promised revenge on the other. The winner, that nasty boy Cho Yunhuk, noticed the guest at once, and with a sly glance in his direction, he said that he was just in time to check who was the strongest in their group. The kids behind his back started whispering slyly, talking about how Yunha and Yunhuk would finally fight. It was scary to imagine what those kids were watching on TV, if they were reacting so violently. But Yunha stepped into the center of the circle, while the crowd was all cheering in anticipation of the bout. In the meantime, Yunhuk pathetically pulled out his toy sword, and pointing it at his opponent threw in a fake movie line about this town being too small for the two of them. He added again that Yunha's fate would be cut short right here, and ordered him to draw his sword. He, in turn, stared at the weapon in doom, barely able to contain his irritation at the whole thing. Yunhuk's loyal henchmen, of course, began to support him, instructing him to win, and wishing him victory with a single blow. And someone behind him also started shouting in support of him to defeat Yunha, who was too much loved by the girls. Yunha himself, of course, didn't quite understand why the guy only cared about that. His name was shouted by his neighbor Min Ji, and he was already happy that at least someone supported him. But the same one, when he turned to look at her, wished he would just die. And in general, he couldn't expect much more from her. The guy was a little frustrated and started to convince himself that he didn't need anyone to support him. But there was still hope. The little girl with Hyan's bow, and she was still upset after the spoiler for the book, crying and yelling that she hated him. Yunha was embarrassed by this, but he accepted that he was alone in life and picked up that toy sword. He had decades of combat experience behind him, and it was clear that all these guys were finished. Imagining themselves in a huge medieval arena, the guys finally announced the start of the fight. Yunhuk was the first to rush at his opponent, but his punch was successfully stopped. Yunha very deftly disarmed him and pushed him back a bit. He only had time to raise his head as he watched his sword spinning on the fly, and Yunha took advantage of the moment and went on the attack. He swept past his opponent, clipping his side. and the toy sword at that time had already finally fallen to the floor, just as its owner fell to his knees defeated. After which, the victor put down his sword as well. But Yunha couldn't accept his defeat, and assured that he could still continue to fight. But only if he could utilize his hidden strength. He groaned defiantly, and slumped to the floor with his whole body. Yunha caught a bit of Spanish shame from his acting. The result of the fight he was very much satisfied with. And all the guys around him started to cheer for the guy in excitement. All those who didn't believe in him before now praised him as if they expected nothing else but victory. Some of the girls, impressed by his masterful play, again pretexted him to play with them in the family. The boys, meanwhile, awarded him the title of worthy to draw Excalibur. Yunha froze in shock, not understanding what was wanted of him, and one of the guys dragged him towards the chained sword that was poised in a pile of constructor. Behind the hero's back, the guys were talking about their excitement that they would finally see someone pull out Excalibur, and expressing their faith in him in every possible way. Yunha was already resigned to the fact that he would have to do it, and curiously grasped the hilt of the sword. And with a bit of effort, as expected, he pulled the weapon triumphantly out of the improvised stone. And the people around him shouted again, praising the lad and rejoicing at his achievement. All the guys surrounded him, and started shouting the winner's name over and over again. At first, he was pleased with this support, but then he started begging them to stop. His plea to stop could be heard even outside the kindergarten itself. Meanwhile, at one of the benches in a small square in the city, where someone's phone was still on, a new emergency was being reported. 7th-class goblins had appeared in the city, and though the Mariner Knight Order had become on the lookout for them, 2 goblins had still managed to escape. The lost phone itself was bloodstained and broken, but it continued to broadcast the news. And at the same time, the shadow of one of them could be seen nearby. The anchorwoman added that according to the Sunbuku Mana Control Bureau, goblins try to blend in with the crowd in crowded places. Therefore, the authorities are asking that if anyone spots one of them to report it as soon as possible. And the goblin next to the phone kept on hammering someone. A little while later, No Yunha's group was playing freeze frame in the daycare area. And while everyone was busily running around freezing and unfreezing each other, Yunha himself finally exhaled and sat down under a tree. He was already bored to death with this running around, and he didn't understand why the other children weren't tired at all. Sighing, he took a more comfortable meditation pose, and decided to use the free time to accumulate mana. After the change of the future, it was extremely necessary, because after a little time, in mana will begin to see a lot of power. Therefore, it was better for the guy to accumulate more mana, and just after what happened on the bridge, he was able to accumulate more mana. Yunha was approached by the guys again, asking him to play again, since he had already rested enough. But the boys still couldn't understand their monstrous endurance. All the children's attention was taken over by the teacher, rather calling everyone for ice cream. They quickly ran over to the man begging for their favorite flavors of the treat, and Yunha, who was actually already 39 years old, mentally laughed at the children, and calmly headed towards the teacher. And he was already barely coping with the hungry kids, trying to politely serve ice cream for everyone. From his bag, one packet was pulled out at the same time just by Yunha and Minji. They froze in bewilderment for a split second, and then immediately started arguing over whose ice cream was whose. The girl insisted that she had taken it first, but the hero didn't want to give in to her. The teacher watched their quarrel in shock, and they could not find a solution. Then he snatched the pack from the hands of both of them, and reminded them that he had asked everyone not to quarrel with their friends. The kids were still looking at the teacher with excitement, and he broke the ice cream in two, explaining that they could just share, and gave both kids half each. But Minji and No Yunha were not appeased by this, and they decided to choose who would get all the ice cream by playing a game of rock, paper, scissors. No sooner had they started arguing than the teacher again, holding back as much as possible and smiling, reminded them that they had to share. But his fake emotion the boys still understood, and peacefully agreed. Hyan called after the teacher, wondering where Yunhuk was. The man suggested that he might be somewhere in the garden, But he didn't know exactly, and Minji added that he was 100% somewhere swinging his sword again. She didn't understand why he was always playing with himself, and Yunha replied to himself that it was special training and should be done in secret. He began to eat his ice cream quietly, and suddenly he heard Minji's voice again, telling Hyan that there was no need to bring Yunhuk anything, and he should come if he wanted ice cream. But Hyan replied with concern that it makes her sad to realize that the guy is out there alone while they are all eating. Minji laughed at her and simply replied that the girl's main flaw was that she was too cute. Taking out another ice cream, the teacher asked Hyan again if she wanted to bring Yunhuk some ice cream, and she happily agreed. Minji asked if her friend wanted her to go along with her, but she sweetly replied that she could manage on her own. The teacher asked all the kids to bring the trash to him when they finished eating, while Yunha watched sadly as Hyan ran off towards the ice cream case. Though he was rather unhappy that she was running towards Yunhuk. He woke up when the other kids were calling everyone to the freezing game. Minji came up to him, inviting him too, but the boy said he didn't want to, and that he had enough games for today. Then the girl replied that with such a reaction no one else would play with him, and Yunha again indifferently told her not to worry about it, and to go play by herself. But Minji didn't give up as Sister Yuna told him to play with him specifically. Before he could even think about his overprotective sister, the girl pulled him into the game. By the game of rock, scissors, paper, the kids chose who would drive, and ironically it was Yunha who was the loser. All the kids started scattering around, and clearly not happy with this outcome, the boy chased after Minji first. He successfully caught up with her and froze her. The girl only sighed capriciously, but Yunha was already forming a cunning plan in his head. He caught up with the next guy and passed the role of the one driving to him. The one even cried out a little in pain, and the hero chased back towards Minji. He ran right at her, making her a bit confused, and after passing her. But immediately, with the most sly smile possible, he turned back around and melted her. The girl gave Yunha a disgruntled glance, and at that moment, the boy who was driving ran up to her. He passed his roll to her, hitting her shoulder so hard that she even groaned, and then shouted for everyone that Minji was now driving. Her eyes even lit up out of pure anger at Yunha. She promised that Yunha would now remain a dead man. But the guy only smugly interrogated if she really had her mind set on catching him. After a few seconds, his pupils suddenly narrowed sharply, and he froze in place. Minji ran up and clapped him on the shoulder, and handed him the roll of freezing. Right afterward, she noticed that her comrade had frozen for some reason. The boy looked around in horror, not understanding from where in the kindergarten he could feel the desire to kill. And then from behind the manor gate, a huge hand slipped through. Yunha immediately became alert, realizing what could happen, and all the children just froze in bewilderment, looking at the strange creature. 2 7th-grade goblins came through the fence. The kids didn't have time to react before the monsters jumped into the garden, and one of the girls found herself right at the goblin's feet. She cringed and called for her mom, and from fear could not move, and at the same time the monster began to attack her with a huge axe. After which, there was the sound of a blow. But during the strike, the girl fell to the ground in shock, and the axe from the hands of the goblin someone knocked out with the help of mana. Now the monster froze in bewilderment, and Yunha, who had disarmed him, now had to defend himself from the second furious attacker. The guy was very quick and agile in dodging its blows. He had gotten bored with goblins in his past life, so he was determined to kill this one quickly and go help others. Yunha concentrated energy into a small wooden wand and began to attack the monster in response. And from outside, the teacher's very fast footsteps were heard as he struck the second goblin with his ordinary brush, not letting it get away unpunished. However, the man was still frightened, and while Yunha marveled at his precise strike, he ordered him to stop and launched the same brush right into the belly of the monster attacking the guy. The hero was still in shock at the teacher's strength, and he quickly pulled him to him, and threw him on his shoulder along with the other girl. The man asked the children to hold on tight, and rushed towards the building as the goblins started chasing them again. He ran as fast as he could, while asking if his charges were all right. The little girl was in floods of tears, and Yunha, who was very shaken from above, barely answered that yes. The first goblin leapt at them again, and the teacher, noticing him, began to chase them even faster. But they could hardly dodge it, so Yunha concentrated his mana in his hands and tried to repel the goblin's attack. And it worked very successfully. The energy launched by the guy knocked down the first monster, and he crushed the second monster as it fell. This time, there was a very loud sound of falling and groans from the goblins, and the boy could exhale quietly as the teacher continued to drag them along. Finally, they ran into the common room where all the other kids were. Teacher Teo was very exhausted and just laid down on the floor to catch his breath. The girl was still very scared and was crying while another teacher tried to calm her down. Only Yunha was still remaining alert. Coming to his senses, the teacher immediately asked the principal above him what was wrong with the other children now. She reassured Teo that everyone had already been evacuated, and asked if it was really goblins that had attacked the kindergarten. He confirmed that it was the same goblins that had been reported a couple days ago. The principal said that she had already reported them to the emergency services, and they just had to wait for the players. The teacher then decided to go help the rest of the staff barricade the door, but he was interrupted by the girl's call. Minji ran to him in terror to inform him that Yunhuk and Hein were nowhere to be found. Teo and the principal freaked out even more at this news, and the children around them tried to remember where they had last seen them. Someone said that they were in the garden and went to get ice cream, so the teacher was determined to bring them back. The principal tried to stop him, and another teacher who was already crying with terror along with the children argued that he should stay here. But the children themselves were very worried about their comrades, and in tears begged him to bring them back. Out of sight for all at that moment was an ajar window, through which the wind and screaming broke through. The yelling resounded throughout the kindergarten. One of the goblins still found the lost Hein and Yunhuk, and the boy was even able to grab him. He continued to howl in fear as the monster swung his axe at him. But Hein, who was watching this, couldn't let her friend die and somehow channeled a stream of mana at the goblin. Her powerful energy was indeed able to repel the attack, and as a bonus to throw the offender somewhere to the side. Immediately after, the girl rushed to help her comrade up, asking if he was alright at all. In the meantime, the goblin had already managed to get up and head back towards them. The children were barely trying to get away and were shaking with terror. Yunhuk tried to gather his thoughts and, grabbing Haeon's arm tightly, tried to run away with her. The boys ran out to the open area, wondering what they should do next. After reassuring his girlfriend that the adults would definitely save them, the boy suggested they just hide until they arrived. They decided to climb up some contraption shaped like a rather tall ladder. Yunhuk let Haeon go first and helped her up. He couldn't climb up himself, as the goblin was already approaching them, so he asked the girl to climb up on her own. But she did not accept why the boy does not climb himself, because he also needs it. But he replied that he would try to hold off the monster until the adults came. Haeon was still begging him to stop and climb up to her, and he already had his sword ready for battle. The goblin, who was several times larger than the boy, didn't quite understand his actions, but he was very serious. Yu Hook watched the broadcast with Kong Hyun Chul, where the latter defeated the Kraken. He was very inspired by the hero, and decided to become one too. Clenching his sword tightly in his hands, he decided that he would be like a fire demon, and he challenged the goblin without fear or arrogance. He clenched his jaw and shouted again, rushing to attack the boy. Yunhuk tried to gather himself and remember all his training, and then immediately launched a counter-attack. But upon collision, the guy's weapon simply flew out of his hands. The sword fell a few meters away from them, and the boy was left alone in terror, disarmed in front of the monster. He managed to swing his axe at Yunhuk, while someone picked up his sword behind his back. When the goblin's weapon was already flying at the boy, he squinted in fear, realizing that he was finished. But after a few seconds, nothing happened, and he opened his eyes in bewilderment. Hein on top of the barricade was also in shock, because they were saved by No Yunha. After the guy fought off the attack, he praised Yunhuk. The hero called him a real man, to which the boy himself was very surprised. At that time, a goblin flew at Yunha from behind again. Yunha immediately began to shout, warning of the attack, to which the hero, calmly, with one powerful blow, completely cut off the monster's arm. It was just as the hand in which he held the axe, and while the goblin had not yet regained consciousness, but Yunha had decided not to stop. He swung again, concentrating the mana in his sword, and chopped the attacker simply in two. The monster's flesh was enveloped in a powerful fire, leaving only a cut diamond in its place. The hero was finally able to exhale, and allowed his comrades to catch their breath as well. Yunha rushed at him with hugs and praise. He threw him to the ground in tears, and the guy couldn't stand it anymore, and tried to push him away with all his might. But at the same moment, Hyan also came at him with a hug. She too was tearfully saying how scared she was, and thanking her friend. And Yunha, feeling as awkward as possible, was still trying to somehow get away from them. A little while earlier, when in the common room, the children were urging the teacher to save Yunha and Hyan, the boy had managed to sneak out through that open panoramic window. He carefully stepped outside, and with a calm exhale, he activated his abilities, and began scanning the area with mana. He sensed Hyan first, as she had more mana than him. And after that, he found Yunha as well, realizing that he was fine as well, and the guys both managed to escape. But before he went to them, he noticed another goblin approaching the gymnasium where the other kids were. He decided to get rid of him first. He sniffed around and kept repeating something in his own language, until Yunha caught his attention. The guy stepped in front of the monster, armed once again with a clerical knife. He gathered energy in it, and when the crazy creature rushed at him at full speed, delivered the first blow. Immediately after, he pushed himself off the ground first, and then the wall as well. Eventually, he was right above the goblin's head, and after collecting more mana, he struck a powerful blow to his back. He winced in pain and got even angrier, but the guy flew up again and pushed off the ladder and gave another blow to the goblin. With the large amount of energy used, he managed to cut the goblin in half as well, and it instantly burned to ashes, leaving behind only a gemstone. Yunha couldn't use the knife anymore, so he threw it away with the diamond. He didn't understand who he had to be to break into a kindergarten like that, and threatened to kill him as soon as he caught him. Immediately afterward, the boy rushed to the aid of his comrades, hoping that they would hold out until he came. He ran to them with all his legs, while their loud shouting was heard on the grounds. The boys were all right now, and they were sobbing on his chest. Yunha was getting over it, and just then a teacher ran up to them. Tayo called out to the kids and asked if they were okay, but they all kept on roaring at the guy. Only No Yunha ended up briefly confirming to him that they were unharmed. Already towards the evening, quite a few players and other uniformed people had arrived at Duan's kindergarten. One of them started questioning the guy if he was really the one who was able to kill the goblin. Yunha tried to justify to him that the monster was already very wounded, and just disappeared when he hit it a couple times. But the player wasn't entirely convinced. He knew that even though goblins were from the 7th or 8th danger class, they weren't so weak that they could be defeated by a 7-year-old child. The monsters could only be killed by destroying their core with a mana-infused weapon or a strong physical attack. Then the kid also suggested to the officer that he kill the goblin that killed the second goblin. Then it comes out that he was very weak after their fight, that Yunha was able to deal with them. He also added that the two monsters were both out of order, and then the player, after thinking for a bit, agreed with what he said. After a while, one of the managers in Sunbuggu's office expressed a solemn apology to Duan Kindergarten on his behalf for this recent incident. There were quite a few reporters and cameramen present at the conference. The man behind the podium promised that from now on they would do their best for the well-being of the affected kindergarten, to which teacher Tayo, Hyan and Yunha, who were also in the crowd, were very happy. Finally, the man introduced everyone to the hero of the day, No Yunha. The guy stood on the stage looking rather tense, as he was just about to be presented with a certificate for bravery. His comrades, teachers and other guests were cheering him on with applause, and he was already imagining how his parents would give him a hard time. They would not be happy that Yunha had done something dangerous again without thinking of the consequences, just like with the Kraken, and they would make him explain himself. He had already accepted the fact that he was a dead man, and tried to keep a normal face, when the photographers asked him to smile wider. At Duan's kindergarten, after a while, they started holding a festival. The children in it acted out a fairy tale on stage, where Hyan played the role of the beautiful white-faced princess Snow White. And the kind princess had 7 dwarfs who love her very much. They were played by boys in green costumes and with hubcaps. They were all laughing merrily on stage, and the teacher Taeyo was voicing what was going on, being cute with his students. Backstage at the time, both Yoo-hook and Yunha were preparing for their entrance. Yunhook was very nervous and had completely forgotten his lyrics, which the other guy didn't quite understand since he only had one line. Yunha reminded his comrade of his words, and the latter first chickened out of excitement, and then began to rejoice that he remembered everything, talking about a certain captain. His reactions were very strange, and as the hero noticed, after the situation with the goblins, he changed a lot. Yunhook now admired his savior, and began to call him a warrior. But Yunhook didn't like it, so they agreed that he would call him captain. The lad tried to look up to him, and had already promised his captain enough to show exactly how good an actor he could be. And this title as well made Yunha a bit tense, as it sounded quite strange. A new character had just appeared on the stage. Turning to the princess, Min-ji as the villain, offered her a marvelous red apple. She masterfully played back a sly smile, asking if her fruit really looked appetizing. Snow White sweetly agreed, but as she reached for the apple, her faithful dwarves began asking her not to take anything from the stranger. One of them immediately assumed that the fruit was poisoned. And just then, Unhook joined them on the stage, barely able to squeeze out a sound. He started yelling for some reason, and after scaring everyone around him, he proceeded to convince the princess not to eat it. The teacher's glasses even burst from his squeak, and everyone in the hall was completely misunderstood for a moment. But immediately afterward, the whole room erupted in laughter, and Yunha backstage simply recognized that he was playing like a robot. Min-ji, who didn't know what to do, threw the apple at Hyan's face so that she would just eat it and leave him alone, but she missed, and the apple went straight into Yunhook's mouth. The girl shouted even more angrily that it wasn't for him, and the dwarves began to mourn the death of the boy, who fell to the floor trembling from the blow. The teacher tried to somehow draw out the situation and start to change the story a bit. He voiced everything that had happened on stage, and the kids stared at him in bewilderment. He tried to cheer them up, and added that the evil queen had not given up, insisting that Min-ji should keep playing. Afterward, he said that she made Snow White eat the rest of the apple. The girl was a little shocked, but really took that apple and put it into Hyan's mouth. Just as she did so, her hood came off, and the princess recognized her as her mother. But the queen ran away and claimed that she was not her mother, but her stepmother, and she had already ordered her not to call her that. After she left, Snow White looked at the apple again, and the poison supposedly began to take effect, after which she fell unconscious to the ground. The rest of the dwarves, along with the teacher, still tried to drag Yunhook backstage. And already there, Taeyo turned to the last actor. Now he could only rely on Yunha, and already barely holding back tears, and tried to motivate the guy that they would bet on the best performance. But Yunha was getting a little annoyed with this teacher. Taking a glance at the stage where the princess was already lying beautifully in the flowers, he headed straight towards her. But as soon as he was out of the backstage area, voices were heard. People were talking about him, the same guy who had killed the monster. Some were scary, and some didn't believe it, but they knew that the Iseg had been awarded by the mayor's office. Hearing this made Yunha stop for some reason. Even though the entire hall had already shut up, it began to occur to him that he wasn't just a kid killing a monster. He was a monster that didn't hesitate to sacrifice people's lives, a monster like a player, a legendary immortal. This illusion was interrupted by his sister's voice. She was calling out to him from the hall. Pulling himself away from his thoughts, he noticed her waving at him, and after that, compliments began to be showered on him by his parents as well. Even his little brother was trying to say something. The boy hovered for a second, and then laughed sweetly, answering his family that they were embarrassing him. He turned to Snow White and came closer, already gathered exhaled. He then spoke his words, wondering how someone so beautiful could exist in their world. Yunha gently leaned over to the girl and kissed her forehead. As she should, she slowly opened her eyes, and with the help of her prince, stood up. The whole hall applauded enthusiastically, especially Yunha's parents. And the kids bowed beautifully to them all, thus ending the performance. The kids now ran out from backstage to the guy, praising his performance. And on Yunha's count they gave him a hand and started tossing him around, but Yunha was not happy about it, and moreover he thought it was dangerous. He thought he was going to fall, but someone caught him. It was his father, who also said that the guy was very good. And he replied that it was because he was his son. Just then, the rest of the family joined them. And his mom suddenly turned to him and asked him again what he was going to do. Yunha stiffened a little, for she had asked the same thing she had asked last year. And then to that question, he sadly replied that he didn't know. And he didn't know, and still didn't know what he should do. But the only thing he wanted, looking at his family and his comrades, was to be happy. And he wanted no one to stop him from being happy. And now, with a little doubt, but satisfied, he answered that he wanted to be a warrior. Afterwards, he asked his father to let him go back to the earth, and he jokingly called him a warrior and fulfilled his wish. The boy's mom with a very warm and proud look just watched him in silence. And when Yunha ran to his comrades, they happily supported him, and even Yunha's sudden tight embrace did not bother him now. A year later, all of these kids were at the elementary school entrance ceremony. The school administration was just giving a speech, and Yunha in the crowd was already yawning tiredly. At that moment, he was already 8 years old. Min-ji behind his back asked him unhappily why he was doing this since the principal was giving a speech. And he simply answered her that she herself was no less strange. The girl was as angry as ever, but they were interrupted by Hyan as well, relaying the teacher's request to be quieter. But then Yunha also showed up, and with a sparkle in his eyes, he began to ask his boss when he would be in charge here among the strong guys. But Yunha replied that he wouldn't be. The boy also suggested that his hero, as a real captain, must be worried about him, to which he did not even try to answer. The principal continued to talk about school life, and Yunha continued to pester his friend, which he was already tired of. After moving to their classrooms, all the children began to introduce themselves. The first to introduce herself was Kim Min-ji. She greeted everyone, said what neighborhood she was from, what kindergarten she went to. And then she started talking about her interests, that she wanted to play and make friends. She liked melodramas and music. Everyone in the class listened to her a little perplexed, and did not understand why she was talking for so long. She had already been interrupted by the teacher herself, asking her to continue the story another time, as they didn't have much time today. The boys were in the 4th grade of the first-year class, and they got a very nice and polite class teacher, Eugenia. Min-ji accepted the fact that she wouldn't say much today, and finally sat down, and the children around them could now exhale quietly. The next person was asked to introduce himself was No Yunha. He humbly got up from behind his desk, said his name, and said he came from Duin Kindergarten. He also expressed his hope to make friends with the new group. The teacher again asked in puzzlement if that was all, to which the boy briefly replied that it was. Afterward, Yang Hyan was supposed to introduce herself. But she was very nervous at the teacher's request to introduce herself. She mumbled something very embarrassingly, and could not finish her sentence. Finally she was able to introduce herself, but then she trembled again. So, after a while, they arrived at Hyan's big and beautiful house. At the entrance, they were greeted by the girl's father, who politely introduced himself and Hyan herself. A group of the girl's friends also greeted them kindly. Getting to this house was clearly not easy, as Hyan's father suggested. He, however, offered to make the children a delicious lunch for them and asked, first of all, what kind of drink they were going for. The man aroused Yunha's uncommon interest, for he thought he had seen him before. He sank into his thoughts, trying to remember while all the children begged Hyan's father for their favorite drinks, or chocolate and yogurt. The man kindly listened to everyone and turned to Yunha one last time. He just snapped back to reality and replied on automatic that he would have an espresso. Everyone stared at him in shock, so he quickly changed his order to banana juice. When the food was ready, the guys started their meal with shining eyes. All of the dishes looked excellent and tasted equally exquisite. The children munched on one after another, just glistening with delight. At their praise of the food, a smug Minji confirmed that Daddy Hyan was a very good cook. Yunha didn't quite understand why she was showing off then, and she justified it by saying that Hyan was her friend. The guy then mockingly called her a foodie, which really pissed her off, and then also her weird nickname. The girl was furious and Yunha was just mocking her. At that time Yunha, who hadn't tasted anything yet, was trying to guess how delicious it all must be for them to react just like that. But after taking a couple sips, he was shocked at what he had just drunk. His mana began to recover. He couldn't believe his eyes, but he had a real potion in his hands. Potions were elixirs that replenished mana in a person's body. Players who fight monsters always carry it with them. For them, it often equaled life. Hyan, who was watching the strange reaction of the guy, asked if it was normal or if he didn't like the drink. Yunha argued that it was delicious on the contrary, and decided to ask the girl what her father's name was. She was a little surprised by the question, but kindly replied that her father's last name was Yang and her first name was Sakhan. Then it hit him, and with shining eyes, he began to ask Hyan to become close friends with him. The girl froze in shock for a few moments. Yak Snowhook, as Yunha remembered from his past life, is the man who revolutionized the potions market. He carefully selects the ingredients and has the gift of filtration, which also allows him to extract mana. In the future, he is the one who will be the king of the potion market and Alice Group, one of the 3 biggest companies in South Korea. But previously, the guy hadn't heard that he had a daughter, so he thought about it a bit. It just came to him. Hyan was still alive because he saved her from the goblin. So he put his hand on the girl's shoulder, and turning to her, he seriously stated that if anyone was bothering her at school, she should just tell him. And then, he wouldn't just let it go. And Hyan, a little embarrassed, quietly agreed and thanked him. And then, remembering the support of her friend, at the performance in front of the class, she finally pulled herself together. She replied that she was also from doing kindergarten, like Yunha and Minji, and that she liked to read and drink tea. She also added that she was very shy when socializing with new people, but asked everyone to socialize with her in spite of that. She exhaled and sat down, and the guys applauded her, and Yunha himself also supported and praised his best friend. Haeon was praised by the teacher as well, and then asked Jean Sona to introduce herself. Yunha turned around to her, and was a little surprised to see her fox ears, as well as a small fluffy tail. All the kids were also surprised by this as well, for they were real. And while the rest of the kids were terrified that she might be a monster, Yunha realized that she was a half-breed. That was the name given to people who were born with poor mana distribution, which caused them to have such mutations. And people who lost loved ones to monsters hated half-breeds because of their similarities to monsters. The girl was also embarrassed to introduce herself, told that she didn't go to kindergarten, and suggested that everyone should make friends. But the boys in the class began to whisper that they were not allowed to approach her by their parents. And as Yunha realized, there were a lot of stereotypes about half-breeds. Afterwards, the teacher wanted to ask the next student to introduce himself, but before he could even say his name, Yunha started to introduce himself. He said that he liked to swing a sword, and that his boss was teaching him how to control Manu. The other students didn't quite understand which boss they were talking about, and Yunha chuckled a little at them, and pointed directly at his comrade. He loudly announced to everyone that Yunha was the boss here, that he was the boss of the class, and that no one should even think of going against him, because he was very strong. The guy started shouting at the whole class, glorifying the boss, while the teacher politely asked him to calm down. And afterward, With a sigh, she ordered Yunha to stay after class and bring his parents, so the class teacher could talk to them. Yunha was still reeling from the embarrassment after Yunhuk's introduction, almost in tears as he sat there, not realizing what he had done wrong. He sighed heavily and accepted that this was all going to be very tedious as expected. And when Yunhook started shouting praising the boss again, but Yunhook was sent to the teacher's room altogether. And he, being very angry, promised Yunhook to give Yunhook a living hell in training. Coming to the canteen after a while, Yunhook could only finally exhale. Now the mana amount tests for the first year were finally over. Yunhook and Sona definitely came out above average E, and Hyan's mana couldn't be measured at all. But still, the committee thought it was some kind of mistake and put Hyan in the averages. But in any case, everything is just without precedent, so it was possible for the guys to eat in peace, and just as Yunhook was beckoning the captain to their table. After a while, the guy went up again, informing the captain that he would bring more food. And Yunha remarked that the cook would soon remember him, as this was the third time he had run for more. Yunhook at that time, not taking the hint, replied that she already knew his name. Minji stood up and asked Yunhook if he had had enough, for she also wanted more. And the guy smiled evilly at her words, because it was just the right time to tease the girl by making her a glutton. She got angry, of course, and started to justify that she was not a glutton, but just took a smaller portion from the beginning. Heian confirmed that Yunha was wrong this time, but he continued to laugh. Their bickering was stopped by the conversations that suddenly started around them. All the guys were discussing the girl with the tail. She had just entered the cafeteria, but the kids were already fearfully indignant that people like her shouldn't enter the school, and were afraid to look her in the eye. She walked on in embarrassment, turning around everywhere to find an empty seat. When she saw one, she went over to a table where a few disgruntled girls were sitting and politely asked if she could sit there. But one of those girls bluntly and arrogantly forbade her. Yunha as well as the rest of his friends understood where this was going to lead now, and sympathized with her good fortune of choosing Jin-san over them all. She called the half-breed crazy, since she thought she could sit at the same table with them. Her girlfriends also began to support Senna and humiliate the girl. They mocked her clothes, and said she should have stayed in her church instead of coming to school. Sona was simply stunned, and humbled and apologized. Minji was furious and started screaming, unable to understand how Sona could be so mean, and why she thought that because she was rich, she could treat others like that. Hyan was also frightened by her cruelty, but Yunha suddenly hovered, which surprised Yunhook a bit. Sona cried, from which those girls also began to scoff, and the hero suddenly began to remember. In his past life, he was told that not all half-breeds are kind, and he must think that the poorer a person is, the further he is removed from society, and the kinder his heart is. This was asked of him by a half-breed acquaintance of his, who for some reason claimed that all these judgments were false. He said that of course there are good people or children among them, but there are still more bad ones. Yunha answered him indifferently, not realizing what he was getting at. He went on to say that he shouldn't treat those kids better just because they were half-breeds, and if he was doing that because of this same acquaintance, he should stop. But Yunha wondered why in Jing Paran's opinion he was being kind. Paran tried to object. After all, that wasn't what he was talking about. Then Yunha started to draw his sword. He asked if by any chance that comrade thought he was weak. Jean Paran was so frightened by his reaction that he even fell off his chair, making excuses to the boy and asking what the problem was. Yunha grudgingly complained that this half-breed had come to his tent in the middle of the night and was bothering him. He threw Paran out and ordered him to go on patrol if he didn't want to get one. The already terrified half-blood had no choice but to agree and stormed out of Yunha's tent. When their team finally reached the Abyss dungeon, Paran was still courageously fighting the monsters there. He stopped for a second to catch his breath after killing a rather strong worm, but at that moment, the guy was mercilessly wounded by another monster that suddenly appeared. The half-breed curled up in pain, and the monster took out his huge paw and stood over him. Now he began to make another attack on the boy to finish him off. But a moment later, his paw was cut down by No Yunha. From the unbearable pain, the monster screamed at first, but almost immediately began to retaliate. Yunha barely dodged and grabbed his sword with both hands and began to chop the monster. He swept past it and struck many blows, and eventually the monster simply disintegrated into small pieces. And Yunha was now already running to help his trembling friend. He helped him roll over and lay on his back, and the half-breed himself ordered the hero to leave quickly, and not to stop because of him, because they had already come so far. Yuan also ran up to them, and Yunha asked her to help the wounded man. But the man stopped them. He reminded his comrades that he knew those wounds very well. And the healer himself began to tremble at the sight of him. He resigned himself to his death, and thought it was all to kill as many monsters as possible. Many people and monsters had already fallen around as well, so Paran was telling them not to stand still. Yunha then humbled himself and asked the guy for at least some last words. And the guy just reminded him of the dialogue in the tent. The hero, of course, remembered everything he had said about the half-breeds, and now, before his death, he did not renounce them. He now believed that there might be even more bad in the world, and asked his comrade not to turn a blind eye to it. All because Paran himself recognized that he was no different from them. He bluntly admitted that he was a very, very bad person, and immediately after that he finally blacked out. Yunha stood over him with shaking hands and terror in his eyes. He finally woke up in the dining hall, and didn't understand why he was remembering all this now. But afterward, the guy abruptly stood up, and turning to Min-ji, asked for some space. She sighed. Azil knew in advance that this would happen, and Yunha was already halfway to Sona at that time. Yunhuk also asked to go with him, but the guy ordered him to just eat and stay away. Jean Sona was still standing there poking at the tray. No one understood what she was going to do, and continued to scoff. But Yunha abruptly took the tray from her hands, and called her with her, so found her a seat. But the girl didn't have time to think so quickly, and reached for the guy in shock at having her food taken away from her. She wanted to say something, but when she noticed that she had grabbed his sleeve, she suddenly jumped back and apologized. Yunha replied that it was fine, and once again kindly explained that his friends had found a place for her. Yunhuk was already beckoning her from the table, but she suddenly stopped and confusedly warned that it would be worse for them if they helped her. But the guy said he didn't care about that, and pulled her to the table with him. And those three arrogant girlfriends started talking about those guys amongst themselves. They only knew that the company was from doing kindergarten, and wanted to ask for information about them, but Jing Sena stopped them. She didn't think it was worth it to look for anything about them, because it was already obvious from them that they were nothing. As soon as the half-breed approached the right table, she was greeted by Min-ji, immediately saying that Yunha was a bit stubborn, and she would have to get used to it. Yunha himself grudgingly hinted to Min-ji to be quiet. At that time, Yunha greeted her, saying that the food today was very good. Sona, a little surprised to see him, also said hello, and right after her, Hyen handed her a cup of barley tea from her thermos. And right after that, Hyen offered the new one in the company of girls to be friends, and she silently and embarrassedly thanked without taking her eyes off the cup. All the boys looked at her, and complimented the taste of it, and asked her to drink it slower and more carefully, as it was hot. The half-breed stared at her reflection in the drink for a few moments, and then downed it all in one gulp. The other guys were surprised at this, and she now started eating her food very fast. Yunha then told her not to hurry so much, and Yunhuk added that no one would take her food away from her. And Sonia's tears suddenly started to text from that. The guys questioned her again in shock, asking her not to cry and offering her a handkerchief to wipe her tears. After quite some time, they were going to the playground outside the school to play together. Yunha volunteered to drive, and explained to everyone that when he started, they would need to suppress their mana to hide their presence, or conversely use it to improve their physical abilities if they wanted to beat the guy and run away. Jean Sona replied that she didn't know how to control mana, to which Yunha reminded her that she knew exactly how to hide, and was definitely in good physical shape. Min-ji also supported the girl, wishing she could defeat the hero with her strength, even though she didn't think it was possible. As Yunha pointed out, The half-breed probably couldn't use telepathy, her unique ability, but he decided that he would teach her that a little later. He then made a rule for everyone to hide only in the grounds, and not to go inside the buildings. Everyone agreed and scattered around the grounds, while Yunha started counting down from 100. Finally, he finished counting and barely opened his eyes, and stretched sweetly before shouting to everyone that he was going to look for them. He immediately found Yunhuk, followed by Minji, and then Sister Yuna. And while one girl was angry at him, the other admired her brother, and Yunhuk was just lamenting. The hero began to think of who else to find. He didn't feel Haeon's presence at all, and agreed that she managed her mana well. And the next in line was Sona. With a little thought, he sensed her location and rushed over there. But when he looked behind those bushes, he didn't find anyone there, but he saw only the tail of a girl running away from behind the fence. He ran after her, ordering her to stop, but she didn't listen and kept running. Just when he almost reached her, Sona made a powerful leap upwards. As Yunha tried to catch her balance to steady herself, she deftly landed on the roof of the alcove, and replied that she wasn't going to stop. She would not be considered a loser until Yunha caught up with her, and so she continued to run away, and the guys started begging her to come downstairs. At that time, the guys who had already been found also thought about her words. They were also not caught, so they started collecting Manu and decided to run some more. Yuna agreed with them too, and was determined to use mana to speed up. They all scattered in different directions, and Yunha screamed in shock. He didn't quite realize what was happening and grabbed his head in terror, but eventually decided that he would definitely catch up with everyone. He started chasing the guys around the grounds, while Sona climbed up higher and watched quietly. A little earlier, after entering a building, Haeon began to think about where she could hide. She heard that Yunha had already started searching, and she first tried to suppress her mana. She very skillfully gathered a huge amount of it, and surrendered it to the minimum. She couldn't hide inside, so the girl decided to go back outside, but suddenly her attention was drawn to the stacks of books on the stairs. She became very curious, and she began to climb up past the books. She ended up in a large room with a huge amount of books. She looked around and picked up a few books. It was just heaven to Haeon, but she didn't know where she was, and she should probably leave. Still, all this stuff around her fascinated her, and her attention was taken by a brightly colored book at the top of the pile. She wondered what kind of book it was, and even asked about it in a voice, to which she received the answer that it was Alice in Wonderland. Turning around at the voice, she saw right above her a huge elderly man. He had a very stern look in his eyes, which made Haeon very frightened. After a long time, the rest of the kids found this stack of books. Haeon was reading Alice's story, and a very disgruntled Yunhuk flew in. And the girl then, peacefully sitting on the lap of the formidable grandfather, a little in shock tore away from the book. The hero, directly radiating rage, turned to the man, who was also sitting in bewilderment, explaining that their friend had disappeared while they were playing, and that's why he was looking for her now. Haeon jumped up sharply, and her grandfather said she should have warned him right away that she was here with her friends. But she herself had forgotten. The other children watched from behind the door, and noticed that Yunha seemed to be getting angry. He was really furious that she could forget about them. The girl, frightened of him, had already started apologizing, and when he lightly slapped her forehead with his finger, she even shrieked. Now more reserved, the boy asked her to warn the next time if she wanted to go out. Yang Haeon apologized once more, rubbing her head, and Yunha, looking at her face, realized that scolding her further was unnecessary. After all, in that case, she would most likely cry. Afterwards, the hero apologized to the man for them interrupting him, but the man was on the contrary pleased. He was completely bored until Haeon came, and he asked her to come again because it is encouraging for him to have a friend who loves books. The girl couldn't believe it at all, but she was very happy about her grandfather's invitation, and she promised to come tomorrow too, as she really wanted to finish reading the book. Still not happy, the boy pulled her towards the exit, as it was already quite late and they had to go home. But as they were leaving, a man called out to them and offered to give the guys a ride. A very expensive car was waiting for them outside, and Grandpa told everyone who wanted to go to get in. Hai and Yunha and Sona ran in, and Yunha, who was watching in shock, wondered who the grandfather was. The kids really liked the interior of the car, and were checking it for softness and comfort inside. Only the hero outside the window shouted to them that it was really a super expensive car. The man who sat in the front seat ordered the driver to go, and the car immediately sped off into the distance. And Yunha was still standing there watching it with his gaze. He had never ridden in a car like that, so he was very jealous of those guys.